on? That's the number one IT solution. Is it on? Good morning, everyone. Great to see everybody here. I'm excited to continue our study of the book of Psalms with everyone. We are running this class along two parallel tracks in our Sunday morning sessions. We're not going through the Psalms in order, but by theme or by topic. And then during the week, we are following our Psalm reading schedule. So if you don't have one of these and you want to jump in, feel free to jump in where we are. We just read through Psalm 90 this last week, and we're scheduled to pick up with Psalms 91 through 105 this next week. So I noticed there's still several copies available. If you want to jump in with that, late is better than never. And we also have a reading. Your book probably doesn't look like this one. This is an old cover, but it's How to Read the Psalms by Trember Longman. I think we might have burned through the church copies at this point, but it's fairly easy to find and inexpensive online. And we have several more chapters of that book to go as well. I'm not quite caught up with the syllabus in terms of what we're covering on Sunday mornings, but I'm slowly trying to get there. We've been discussing the poetry of the Psalms, how the Psalms work on us, work on our hearts as poetic, artful texts that are full of imagery and parallel lines and use different kinds of genres. So these texts are not essays, they are not sermons, they are poems. They are poems that are meant to be prayed, poems that are meant to be sung, and poems that we are meant to worship with. So we're going to be continuing this discussion of how the Psalms work as poetry and how poetry can access different parts of our hearts and our minds than other types of literature can. So that's a little bit of an orientation to where we are in the class. Let's do a little bit of review. Last week we went over 7 types of psalms. The fancy word we've been using for that is genres of psalms. And this is just one man's take on the kinds of psalms there are. Other people have different lists with different numbers of psalm genres, but this is a good list to start working with. So before I put the names of the 7 types on the screen, and without you cheating by looking in the book, how many can you name from last week? Types of psalms. Hymn. H-Y-M-N. Hymn. Lament. Yes, so praise we'll categorize under hymn for now. I think those are more or less synonyms. Thanksgiving. Remembrance. That's a good one to remember. Wisdom. Oh, kingship or royal. And there's one more I can think of. Trust or confidence psalms. So hymn, lament, thanksgiving, trust or confidence, remembrance, wisdom, and royal psalms or kingship psalms were the ones we reviewed last week. You can see all that in chapter 1 of the study guide. And we'll return to that list, to that categorization of the psalms a few more times as we go. One quote we didn't get to last week from the study guide that I thought was helpful from this chapter. Our author, Trember Longman, says, genres or types of psalms are not written on tablets of stone. You don't find those in the law of Moses. They are flexible. Psalms may be profitably studied under more than one of our stated genres. In fact, that was a point Jerry made in a previous week, is that he would read a psalm and it would start out looking like one and it would end looking like another one, and that's right. But the point is well established. The Psalms are not completely isolated from one another, but have many features in common. There is no such thing as a completely unique psalm. The identification of the basic genres or types of psalms leads us to the question of their use or function in ancient Israel. How did our spiritual predecessors, the Israelites, use the psalms? And so that's a question that we will come back to a few times as we think about how we bring these psalms from their ancient setting into our modern, contemporary setting. How can we make that bridge between how the Israelites would have used these words and how we as Christians in the modern day can use them? So, I hope that overview of the genres of the Psalms last week was helpful. If you didn't get a chance to, or if you weren't here and you would like a chance to review that discussion, it's on our YouTube page. Any questions about the types of Psalms or any comments about that discussion that we had? Okay. You knew it was coming. Our quiz. Remember that the book of Psalms, like the law of Moses, is divided into 5 parts, and that comparison invites us to think about the fact that the Psalms, in some way, like the law of Moses, is meant to be instruction or teaching for us. And these divisions are in most of our Bibles, and so again, without looking down and cheating from your Bible, let's see if we can remember these division points, the numbers of the Psalms that begin and end each of the 5 books. So, Aaron, I'm going to call on people this week. Book 3. Okay, 70-something to 89-ish. I love the confidence. But, imagine you're a pre-literate Israelite in the ancient world. You've got to depend on your memory here. So. All right, 70 what? Anybody want to help him out for the start? Diane? 73 through 89, not ish, through 89 on the dot. So, very good. All right, book 1. I'm going to pick on Scott back there. 41. 1 to 41, good. All right, book 5. Darlene, can I pick on you? It does. That's up there on the screen already. So ends in 150. You're one off. You see, when you cheat off someone else, you die by the sword. So 107. All right. Since Sean was volunteering answers, I'm going to let him do the next one. All right. Book 2. 41 through 73-ish. Through 72. 42 through 72. So that's ish. Yeah. 1 through 41, 42 through 72, 73 through 89. That leaves book 4. Anybody want to volunteer for book 4? All right, Ralph got it. 90 through 106. Okay, so let's see how we did. 1 to 41, 42 to 72, 73 to 89, 90 to 106, 107 to 150. Now, up to this point, that's just been trivia. It's just been Bible trivia. There's not really been an application to that. But if we make good time today, toward the end of class, I'm going to actually try to make the relevance of these numbers significant. Okay. I'm sensing mutiny in the room, so I'm going to move on. All right, so let's continue thinking about the fact that the Psalms, as poems, use imagery. They create word pictures in our minds as we read them, and we want to ask why they might do this. This is harking back to a previous reading that you had in the Longman book, last week's reading. In chapter 8, he has a whole chapter on the imagery of the Psalms. So, let's define our terms. What is imagery? Pictures, and we can think of pictures in different ways, right? We think of the well-known adage, a picture is worth 1,000 words. You can have a picture that is visual. Think of the picture of snow-capped mountains and trees and over here. But you can also paint pictures in your mind through the use of words and phrases and ideas. And so imagery is both things. It is both the visual and the the mental aspect of things, and we can paint pictures by describing them. So let's talk about some types of imagery, and this would have, again, been in last week's reading. There's a type of imagery that is very common in the Psalms called personification. This may go back to your high school English or something, but what is personification? Okay, it's related to people, but what specifically is it doing?
It's giving non-human things human characters, describing a person as something else.
Right, okay, so it can work in either way, right? So I like the definition of giving non-human things human characteristics. And then the opposite of that would be giving humans description of non-human, or giving them non-human characteristics. So very often in the Psalms, Psalm 22, for instance, the psalmist's enemies are portrayed as wild beasts. It's not that there are actually wild beasts coming after him. It's not that he's being chased by bulls and oxen, but that his enemies are described as fearsome by being compared to those things. The flip side of that would be that things that are not human, both the earth, think of the earth or the heavens being described as talking. Psalm 19, the heavens declare the glory of God. Do the heavens have vocal cords? No. Sure. Okay. Maybe. But the point is that the heavens and earth are being given human characteristics for poetic effect. What is a simile? Again, from our reading last week. Yeah. Right, so Aaron was saying it's a comparison between two things where something is described as being like something. And so in English, the words that you would typically find in a simile are like or as. This is like this. As this, so is this. So, famous example in the Psalms, as the deer pants for the water, so my soul longs after you. So in other words, my soul is like a deer. That's a simile. What about a metaphor? Very similar concept, but what is a metaphor? Yeah, it's basically the same thing, but it's even more strongly stated. This is this. Two things are compared more boldly, and there's no use of a word like or as. The Lord is my rock. Not the Lord is like my rock, or like a rock. The Lord is my rock. Now, is God, whom we worship, literally, minerally, a rock? No. But the comparison is stated strongly by putting it in that way. A equals B. The Lord is my rock. The Lord is my fortress. The Lord is a warrior. These comparisons are made more bold and direct by eliminating the word like. So similes and metaphors are two types of comparison. Personification is another kind of comparison where something that is not human is given human characteristics, or vice versa. Okay, so our author of our study guide says, in brief, an image compares two things which are similar in some ways but dissimilar in other ways. The dissimilarity is what surprises us and causes us to take notice. Then we search for the similarity. So a good, effective poetic image is going to make a surprising comparison between two things. And the surprising nature of that comparison is going to make us stop and think, the Lord is kind of like a rock. But how is he like a rock? Rocks can be really tough to crack. Is that what it means? Is that what the part of God's character that we're being emphasized? Or is it that God gives us solidarity? It's firm. It's not going anywhere. And the psalmist might really want to explore that side of God's personality, and so that image of God as a rock is very useful in that context. But there's also dissimilarities. There's ways in which God is not like a rock. And so the image is a comparison, and so every comparison is going to have its strengths and its shortcomings. Another author who writes not about imagery, but about the way in which Hebrew uses parallel lines in poetry says, in parallelism after parallelism, remember parallelism is the idea that the psalmist says the same thing twice, but changes up the imagery and the wording. In all of these parallel instances, we are torn between the similarity of the lines and at the same time their dissimilarity. So the point is that in so many ways, the Psalms introduce all of these comparisons to us. They'll say something more than one way, and we have to navigate between how God is like a rock and how God's not like a rock. Or if you go to a psalm that describes God with a bunch of terms, like the Lord is my rock and my fortress and my stronghold and my deliverer and my this and my that and my that. All those comparisons make us think about in what way is a stronghold like a rock, or in what way is a stronghold like a shepherd, or in what way is a shepherd like a, insert another metaphor. The point is, all of these comparisons and all of these repetitions force us to stop and think, in what way is God like that for us? In what way does the comparison fall short? So images in the Psalms, or in all of Scripture, are meant to make us think. A word that the Psalms themselves would use is the Psalms imagery is meant to make us meditate on the Lord. We've talked about this idea of meditating when we covered Psalm 1. Blessed is the man who doesn't walk in all these sinful ways, but his delight is in the law of the Lord, and in his law he meditates day and night. And when we talked about that passage, we talked about how the idea of meditating is kind of like the idea of murmuring. It's just saying the words over and over until you have internalized them. And that's what poetic images do. We have to stop and think, God is my rock. In what way is he like my rock? Is it that he is immovable and that every time I pray to him, he's not going to change? He's not going to listen to me? Nothing I can do can sway God? Is that what it means, that God is a rock? Or does it mean that when I need a firm place to stand in all of the changes of life, that I know I can put my feet on God and I'm not going to slip? So you have to think about it. It's not self-interpreting. You have to give the image a little bit of mental work. You have to, as we might say of certain animals, we might have to ruminate on it. We might have to chew the cud a little bit. That's what the idea of meditating is. It's not for instant consumption. It is for prolonged puzzling and thought and wisdom and meditation. So images are invitations for us to open ourselves up to God and think about what he is really like. So that's why all of these images are there for God in the Psalms. Let's not just talk about this in the abstract. Let's go through some Psalms sequentially that we've read in the last couple weeks and look at all of these examples of images for God and for the psalmist and for the psalmist's enemies. So let's start around Psalm 61. We're just going to take a very lightning fast tour through some of the 60s and 70s of the Psalms here. Greatest hits of the 60s and 70s. All right, Psalm 61. Lead me to the rock that is higher than I. We have hymns that borrow from that line. For you have been my refuge, a strong tower against the enemy. Let me dwell in your tent forever. Let me take refuge under the shelter of your wings. Does God literally live in a tent, and does God literally have wings? Well, if we only approach the Psalms in that very literal wooden way, we don't actually get that much out of a text like this. But when we understand that there is an implicit comparison being made, God is like a sheltering bird who covers its young with its wings to keep them safe. God, in a sense, dwells in a tent. Think about the ways in which the tabernacle and later on the temple is described as God's dwelling place, that he's pitched his tent with humanity. that is an approachable image, that God has a place where we can come and be with him and enjoy his protection. And that's obviously what some of these other images are about. Refuge, tower, rock. These are images of security and protection. Next Psalm, Psalm 62. How long will all of you attack a man to batter him like a leaning wall, a tottering fence? Now, what kind of image is this? A simile, metaphor, or personification? Simile, how did you know? It has that word like there. It's making an explicit comparison between two things. So here the image is not about God. It's about the psalmist who feels like he's at the end of his rope. He doesn't have a lot of strength left. What is he like in this image? Yeah, something that's about to fall over. It's not saying that the psalmist is literally made of wood that was poorly constructed. It's saying that's what he is like in this moment. There is a similarity between a structure that's about to collapse and what the psalmist is feeling about himself. The enemies are just relentlessly battering him, and he's asking them, how long are you going to do this? Psalm 63, another popular image that has made it into our hymnody. My flesh faints for you as in a dry and weary land where there is no water. What kind of image is this? Yeah, so the images of a desert. Is this a simile, metaphor, personification? Another simile, this time it uses, at least in the English translation, as, to show that there's a comparison being made. This image might not have been too far off from life in the ancient Near East. There might have been a lot of places in the psalmist's life that were waterless areas where there was dehydration and danger of death happening. Psalm 64. But God shoots his arrow at them. They are wounded suddenly. If we are again limiting ourselves to a literal wooden reading, we have to assume that God in heaven has a quiver on his back and a bow in his hand and is pulling arrows out and smiting the wicked with those arrows, like some sort of Old Testament Cupid or something like that. But if we are understanding that there's a comparison being made, that it's telling us something about the character of God, that God will mete out judgment to those who are opposed to him and opposed to his people, then the point becomes much more clear. This is a metaphor or a personification. Sometimes those terms overlap. God is being described like a human warrior. Psalm 65. The meadows clothe themselves with flocks. The valleys deck themselves with grain. Do meadows and valleys literally get up in the morning, go to their closet, rifle through their hangers, and pick out what they're going to wear for the day? No, but this is a popular way of describing the beauty of God's creation. Think about the Sermon on the Mount. What does Jesus say about God's care for even the smallest little bit of nature in the Sermon on the Mount? Anybody remember the image he uses? So even a sparrow doesn't drop from the sky without God knowing about it. That's part of it. What other image? The lilies of the field. Consider the lilies of the field. Not even Solomon in all of his glory was arrayed like one of these. So Jesus says the lilies of the field have clothes on, and they're beautiful clothes. Of course, they don't literally have that in a way a human would, but there's an image that's being generated, a mental image that's being generated for us. The same thing's going on here. The meadows clothe themselves, as it were, with these flocks of sheep and goats, and there's a beauty to that. Meadows and valleys are a lot better at getting themselves dressed than my 4-year-old is, by the way. We had all the tears and fights this morning about what to adorn himself with. All right, let's keep it going. Psalm 66. For you, O Lord, have tested us. You have tried us as silver is tried. You have brought us into the net. You laid a crushing burden on our backs. Here's an example where there are multiple images being used in the same verse. So there's almost, we might say, a mixed metaphor happening here. The first half of the verse, there seems to be a simile happening. You see that word as? You have tried us or tested us as silver is tried. So what is the realm of this image in the first half of the verse? Yeah, so Jerry, what did you say? Heat. Yeah, I mean, we're in the world of metallurgy, right? I mean, it's that sort of thing happening, how the heat of the fire will test the metal, M-E-T-T-L-E, of a metal, M-E-T-A-L. And that's like what the people are going through. Whatever experience of judgment they're going through is like being stuck into the fire. So it's actually a very powerful image, but it's being set up as a simile there. Then we move to metaphor. You've brought us into the net. We're no longer in the blacksmith shop. We are now perhaps, what would the net imagery conjure up? What kind of scene? Fishing, hunting of some kind, an animal that's being ensnared in some way. But then it changes again. You laid a crushing burden on our backs. There, you can think of the Israelites being slaves in Egypt even, right? And think of how the Pharaoh was oppressing them with their labor. So there's all kinds of imagery happening there in that one little verse. And it's almost to where we don't even think of it as imagery, because it just makes sense kind of intuitively to us. Psalm 67, may God be gracious to us and bless us, and to make his face shine upon us. That's a phrase we can read right by and not think about it, but again, we have to ask simple questions like, does God literally have a face? Some biblical texts kind of say yes, and some of them say no. Is God like a man that he should appear in human form? Other times it said that God does have a face. So we may be somewhere in between literal imagery and figurative here. But even the image of a face shining would take a little bit of explanation. I mean, does your face normally shine? I mean, I guess when you're a teenager and going through puberty, maybe it is, but it just, the image itself is striking. In what way is God like a person with a shining face? And we might think of Bible stories like Moses' face glowing when he comes down from the presence of God on Mount Sinai or something like that. But it's an interesting image that makes us stop and reflect. Psalm 68. I'm simply making the point, you can find imagery in every psalm. We're not going to go through every one in order here. But as smoke is driven away, so you shall drive them away. As wax melts before the fire, so the wicked shall perish before God. So what kind of image is that? It's another simile. As this, like this, so is the thing that I'm actually talking about. Think about how temporary something like smoke or wax is. As soon as you apply a little bit of heat to it, as Jerry was saying, it's gone. That's what the wicked are like in their rebellion against God. They might seem like they're going to be around for a long time, but in reality, they're like smoke. They're like wax. They're going to perish. Psalm 69, let not the flood sweep over me, or the deep swallow me up, or the pit close its mouth over me. Is the psalmist worried about living in a floodplain? No. He's worried that life is going to overwhelm him. But the image, the metaphor of a flood, is very powerfully communicating what the actual emotions of the moment are for him in a way that's more powerful than just, God, I feel overwhelmed. If that's what the verse said, it would communicate, but it wouldn't communicate as effectively as saying there's a flood sweeping over me, don't let it happen. But then it changes, don't let the pit close its mouth over me. Do pits have mouths? In Return of the Jedi they do, but don't worry about that. The point is, there is a personification happening. Pits are not human, but in a way, a pit has a mouth to it, like a human would. So there's multiple images at work here. I have lots more, but I'm going to go ahead and skip the rest. My point is that if you can go through every psalm and find an example of simile, metaphor, personification. Imagery is all over the place. And the more we can recognize it, the more we can meditate on it effectively. So, having been through all that, we can ask the question, why do the Psalms use images in your opinion? Now that we've kind of dug into it a little bit and you've seen it at work, what is your own take on this? Why do the Psalms use this many images? Sean? Okay, I really like this answer. Sean says to evoke emotion in us. Something can connect with you rationally, intellectually, that doesn't connect with you emotionally, right? You can read an article about something happening in the world, and you can intellectually interpret all of the facts that's being said, but you might not have a real emotional connection with that information. When the Psalms bring all of these images into their communication about God, they are communicating information to us, but they're not just communicating information in this sort of data download from the psalmist's mind to our mind. That's not what's going on. There is not just a head connection going on, there's a heart connection happening. And images are really, really powerful ways of getting under the surface of our being. We can build up these walls, we can harden our hearts, we can make ourselves impervious to getting hurt, or so we think. But God has sneaky ways of getting into our hearts. And one of those is through the imagery that we find in Scripture. It's hard to sing certain hymns that come from Scripture that have all of these images without being moved emotionally. Just think about how many people have a favorite hymn like "As the Deer Pants for the Water, So My Soul Longs After You." That simile is really powerful. When you think about it, when you think of a deer, trudging through the forest looking for the nearest water brook, and just the desperation and the helplessness of that image, there's something about that communicates we really need God in a way that's just saying we really need God doesn't communicate. Christina, did you have a thought about that? Yeah. Yeah, this is a real insight, I think. So Christina is saying the vagueness of the Psalms is in fact it's one of the most important things about them, is that they can be related to so many different people and so many different situations. The fact that there is an openness, how do you interpret this image? You could interpret it this way or this way. It might affect one person this way and another person this way, and that's part of what they're meant to do. There's meant to be multiple applications of these images in different times and places and for different people. Images have an openness to them that allow us to remain open to God and for God to surprise us in new ways with the same text and the same image at different times. We don't exhaust a psalm's possibilities when we read it one time. We can return to the same psalm all of our life and get something new out of it because of this openness that psalms have. And so this next quote, Christina's really anticipated what I was going to say here. When using images, whatever is lost in precision is gained in vividness of expression. So there's a trade-off here. Psalms aren't always very precise. They're sometimes a little bit open-ended. What does it mean? But that vividness that the image brings, as a deer panting for the water brooks, that's really vivid. That creates a word picture instantly in your mind. Further, the images, as in poetry in general, speak to us more fully than regular literal language. They stir our emotions, attract our attention, and also stimulate our imaginations. Boy, it's like you guys actually did the reading. You just said all of that in your comments. Annette. Yeah, so Annette's pointing out how the images of the Psalms connect us to the idea that we are meant to be in relationship. And I can't stress the importance of that point enough. In fact, that's sort of the thesis of the author of our study guide, is that the Psalms are all about God's relationship with Israel collectively and with Israelites individually. And the word that he uses for that relationship is covenant. That God is in covenant with us, just as he was with Israel. And covenant is a fancy word for a deep, committed relationship. And images have a way of describing, of plumbing the depths of that relationship that we have with God. And it's a relationship that we are always, hopefully, getting deeper into. Hopefully, our relationship with God right now is not the same as it was a year ago. But it's a relationship that is continuing to evolve and deepen and gain strength. And images, poetic images, can do a better job of describing that process than just literal, dry prose. And so the imagery that is all over the Psalms and the relationship that they're trying to describe, those are two sides of the same coin. So I'm really glad you brought up that idea of relationship. Annette, Aaron?
There's another quote in the book that really hit me, and I think you kind of agree with just with everything that they're saying, but specifically about God. He says, images, particularly metaphors, help to communicate the fact that God is so great and powerful and mighty that he can't be exhaustively described. Metaphor may be accurate, but is less precise than literal language. Metaphor preserves the mystery of God's nature and being, while communicating to us about him and his love for us. I think that's interesting how he says it still preserves this mystery about God, while still, not exhaustive, but still communicating about God.
Right.
We kind of want to know everything. That's hard to accept. It's still going to be a little mysterious.
Yeah. So, how is it even possible that we as humans could attempt to answer a question like, what is God's nature? We're utterly incapable of answering a question of that scale. But what we can do is make some attempts. We can try to get at just a little bit of what God is like. And one of the ways we can do that is through poetic imagery. We can use simile, metaphor, personification. And when we do those things, we're not limiting God. When we say God is a rock, that's not to limit him. That's actually to admit that he's so much more than that, and that we're just trying to get at one little facet of this immensely big prism that is God. And we're just looking at one facet at a time. So yeah, this is actually a way of showing our limitation vis-a-vis God, as opposed to trying to box him in by saying we've explained him. So, Mark. Yeah.
So let me just, because you kind of said there just for a minute. So I think most people would agree God doesn't live in a tent, even though that's stated in the Psalms. Maybe God is not a rock, actually. But the image that many people do have of God is somebody sitting on a throne, holding a scepter,
Right.
holding court like in ancient times with kings and so forth. Is that also an image?
Yeah. So the question is, how far do we take this principle that we can only describe God proximately, that we can only make these little salvos at trying to interpret God? Which images of God in the Psalms and in all of Scripture are literal, which are figurative? Well, I don't have any special revelation on that, Mark. So the one that Mark specifically brought out was, what about this image of God sitting on the throne in heaven? Is that literal? Is that figurative? And I would say that we don't have a lot of access to answering a question like that, but when we understand this principle, that images don't denigrate God, they honor him, they glorify him, then I don't think it is sacrilegious to say that in some sense that is a personification of God. That we are seeing something that we can comprehend, that is a human king sitting on a throne. For us as humans, that is an image of power, might, glory, majesty, and we are ascribing all of those things to God when we say that God sits on a throne.
I like what you said about maybe God being so much more than all that.
Right. So when we say, well, maybe God doesn't literally sit on a throne, we're not denigrating him. We're in fact saying he's more awesome than a human king in all of his splendor would be. Think of all of those scenes in the Scripture where a non-king, a lower person, is invited into a throne room and is just terrified at the splendor of that king. Think about Esther being invited into the throne room of her husband even, somebody that she already had a relationship with, but she knew that if the king doesn't extend his scepter to me, I'm going to die. That's how much power that dude had. And thankfully, she was extended that condescension from the king and was allowed into his presence. Well, God's even greater than that. The distance between Esther and King Xerxes is much closer than the distance between one of us and God. And so when we say God is on his throne, well, maybe not literally. We're not actually saying he's not really in control. We're saying, no, he's even bigger than what we can imagine. Whatever God's throne or kingship is, human kingship is just a tiny glimpse of that. So I would say we should use this concept and have these discussions in the sense of God is beyond our imagination, but when we use imagery, we're attempting to get some small facet of his glory and his majesty, and it is meant to provoke even greater humility and love on our part. So that's how I would address a question like that without claiming to have any special revelation about what's literal and what's figurative. But we, in some sense, all of human speech to some extent is a little bit figurative. We have to speak in these comparisons and metaphors, just so that we can know what we're talking about. But anyway, that's a really helpful question, and I hope that that conversation is a little bit illuminating, and I hope a little bit freeing, because sometimes we can box ourselves in when we say, well, this has to be literal, and this has to be figurative, and then we can paint ourselves into a corner, interpretively speaking. And we want to let God be God, and we want to understand that his ways are beyond our ways, and that any way that we humans speak of God is ultimately going to fall short a little bit. Other thoughts about why we use images, why the Psalms use images. All right. Okay, the last thing I want to cover, and we have just a couple minutes to do it, maybe that's for the best. Why do the Psalms not only use images, but use images that other ancient cultures would have used and apply those images to God? In other words, the way that the Psalms and that the Old Testament describes God is very similar in some respects to the ways that Israel's neighbors would have described their gods. Some of the same images are used, including what Mark was just talking about, picturing a God as seated on a throne. The Babylonians, for instance, the Canaanites, among whom the Israelites lived, would have had similar ways of describing their God. So what do we make of that sort of thing? Just a couple examples, and then we'll have to quit. Remember that Israel doesn't exist in a vacuum in the ancient world. Here's sort of a picture of the Middle East and some of the nations and regions that they would have been surrounded by. Egyptians to the south and west, the Arabian tribes to the south, the Assyrians or Aramaeans to the north, Hittites in Anatolia, the Assyrians off to the northeast, the Babylonians to the east, the Persians and the Elamites and the Medians all past that. These were powerful, powerful nations who all had their own mythologies of what the world was like, who ruled the world, how the world came into being. Israel exists in the midst of all of that. And surprisingly, maybe at first, some of the ways that Israel talks about God has echoes and parallels in the rest of the ancient Near East. So, for example, in contrast to the picture that we see in Genesis 1 about how God creates the world, in Psalm 74, there's another account of how God creates the world, and it's told very differently than Genesis 1. Notice how God's creation of the world is described as kind of winning a battle. God wins a battle in order to create the world. You divided the sea by your might. You broke the heads of the sea monsters on the waters. You crushed the heads of Leviathan, which was a name for an ancient monster. You gave him as food for the creatures of the wilderness. You split open springs and brooks. You dried up ever-flowing streams. Yours is the day, yours also the night. You've established the heavenly lights and the sun. You've fixed all the boundaries of the earth. You've made summer and winter. Well, that last half, that sure sounds a lot more like Genesis. It's describing God putting things in order. But Psalm 74 says in order to do that, first he had to beat up some monsters. That's part of the creation story. Now, that's really interesting because, first of all, it's a little different than what we see in Genesis 1. Genesis 1 seems a little tamer than that in the creation story. But what's interesting is how similar this account is in the Psalms to other creation stories from the ancient Near East. For instance, there was a city far to the north of Israel up the Mediterranean coast called Ugarit. This civilization had probably died out by the time of David, but they were really powerful in the centuries before that. And one text that was unearthed there by archaeologists says, "For you slew Lotan," which is just their word for Leviathan, this monster described in the Psalms, "the slippery serpent, you made an end of the twisting snake, the tightly coiled snake with 7 heads." Now, this is not a hymn or poem to the Lord, Yahweh of Israel. This is a hymn or poem to Baal. Now, we know who Baal is from the Old Testament. That's a false god that was brought into the worship of Israel by Ahab and Jezebel. And Baal was worshipped in many surrounding cultures of Israel, but what's interesting here is that the way that Baal was claimed to have created the world involved killing a monster named Leviathan, or Lotan, and who is described as snake-like, a 7-headed snake or something creepy like that. That's one little image that's been unearthed of what maybe these ancients thought that Baal's enemy, Lotan or Leviathan, looked like. And so look at this comparison between Psalm 74 and this pagan text from Israel's northern neighbors. There's a slaying of a sea monster. Its heads are crushed, its multiple heads. Notice that Psalm 74 verse 14 says, "You crushed the heads of Leviathan," who is described as this sea monster, this multi-headed sea monster. There's a Babylonian story. This is really where I'm going to have to quit here. A Babylonian creation story, a sort of a rival story to Genesis, called the Enuma Elish. And one example of that, of this creation, is that their god, main god, Bel or Marduk, places his feet on the lower parts of Tiamat, which is a sea monster, and with his merciless club smashed her skull. He split her into like a dried fish. On one half of her he set up and stretched out as the heavens. He stretched the skin and appointed a watch with the instruction not to let her waters escape. He fashioned heavenly stations for the great gods and set up constellations, the patterns of the stars. He appointed the year, marked off divisions, and set up 3 stars each for the 12 months. So this Babylonian creation story involves their version of a god slaying a sea monster and splitting its carcass and using that to build the heavens and the earth and appoint all of these seasons and divisions and times. And so Psalm 74 has some parallels to that too, because remember, after the sea monster is slain in Psalm 74, God starts creating order. He puts heavenly lights in place. He fixes times and seasons, summer and winter, and that's exactly what we see, or close to what we see in this Babylonian creation story. A division followed by ordering, as well as beating up on some sea monster. And so here's where I'm going to quit. This is addressed in your study guide. Here's the point. Both the Canaanites and the Babylonians believed that their main god destroyed the sea monster, Leviathan or Tiamat. The Canaanites had stories about Baal destroying a god by crushing his head, and the Babylonians believed that their god killed a goddess named Sea or Tiamat. What is the psalm saying then? Is it agreeing with the pagan religions of their neighbors? Far from it. God's destruction of Leviathan in Psalm 74 is an image of his power. Further, there's a message to the pagan nations here and to those Israelites tempted to worship foreign gods like Baal. That message implicitly stated is, those gods are nothing. You think Baal is something? You think Marduk or Bel is something?